Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on travel and landscape, carrying on with the theme of different workflows every month for various different subjects. So with that in mind, let's keep going. If this is your first webinar, my name's David. I'm part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. And as usual, we have 60 minutes today. And you're very welcome and encouraged to ask questions throughout. At the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see the last section is called questions. So put a question in there, that will come through to me. If you're on iOS or Android, look for the question mark icon in the app itself, and you can ask a question in the same way. I am recording the session too, so don't feel you have to remember everything. It will be on the YouTube channel tomorrow in the usual place. If you haven't visited YouTube before, the Capture One channel, then there's a subscribe link in the follow-up email, which you'll get roughly this time tomorrow. So don't be shy, feel free to ask away if there's anything that's not clear. So let's begin. I just need to come out of Keynote, move into Capture One, which you should see. Let's get not Wacom. Let's get a mouse locator going so that you can see the mouse as it moves around the screen, which might look like this. So what we do today is I've got a few landscapes, we've got some travel kind of street stuff. We're going to play with a black and white down here as well. So a few different techniques and tricks that we can take a look at as well. First thing I was going to do was look at this shot here, and if we just compare it to the sort of final finish to the one that straight out of camera. Quite often we can see that, certainly on landscapes, if they're shot at the wrong time of day, like this one was, straight in the middle of the day when the sun is at its highest. But quite often we get this sort of blue haze or color cast over the image itself, which can be a bit tricky to remove. But there's actually a very simple way to do that in Capture One, which I'll show you now. So I've got two images the same, just so we can compare. So all they are is just virtual copies of the original file. So both of these have no adjustments applied. So let's take the first one. We're going to go into Preferences. And by default, if you look under Exposure, this tab, you'll see in the Levels tool, there's an option called Channel Mode. By default, it's set to RGB channel. This only refers to the auto mode, which is the A in the Levels tool, and indeed other tools, and really describes the behavior of what happens when you hit auto in Levels. So on our first image, let's just go ahead and hit auto. Of course, we see the contrast go up, but it's still got that kind of haziness and color cast about it. So let's go to the next one, this one here. And now in our preferences, we're going to change this to red, green, and blue. And we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to hit auto and let Capture One do a change. So if I go back to the first image, so that's the first one, and the next, just so you can see I'm not cheating. Excuse me. So first image, first, next, like so. So if I flip back and forth, you can see in the second one where we did the slightly different auto levels adjustment, you can see that the color cast is pretty much gone. And then on the initial one, if I get back to Capture One, you can see it's still there. And I'll just explain what's happening. I just need to help someone who doesn't have any sound. I would say to any of you, if you ever get sound issues, the easiest way to fix it is to exit and come back again. So if ever that happens to you in the future. I do notice with GoToWebinar that sometimes it struggles to find the internal sound output, like the speakers on your laptop. It's fine with a connected headphones or something like that, but it really struggles with the basic speakers on the computer. No idea why, but there we go. Okay, so let's go back to this. Let's bring up the preferences. So this one was done with RGB channel, and this one was done with red, green and blue individual channels. So if we look at the levels tool and look under red, green and blue, we can see the adjustments there. It's only done on the composite of the red, green and blue. If we go to this one, we can see we have individual tweaks and the values may change slightly. You can see here, for example, on the various different color tones. And if I grab the blue and pull that out or put it in, you can see that we can actually moderate, if I just do it dramatically, moderate the color caster even further. But this goes a long way to just taking out that color cast. Very simple, doesn't necessarily mean it happens to be on, it's only for landscapes, but anything where you get that kind of underlying color cast can do quite a nice job of taking it away. Vim says, do we use auto level first on every image or try to get the histogram balance via exposure settings? Yes, so in this case, if we look at the histogram, you know, exposure was pretty good right out the bat. If we go to something else, even though that was shot at sunrise or sunset, I think, time is, yeah, sunset, then it's still a little bit on the dark side, so I would probably just lift that a touch before going ahead and then playing around with levels and so on. And I should also say, generally I leave that to RGB channel, but it's handy if you find an image which has a bit of a cast, just to, I don't think there's any others here that have much of a cast, maybe this one as such. This one we're going to look at later for black and white. But preferences, let's do red, green and blue channels and say auto. Then it's a little bit cold anyway, but it probably does just take out a little bit of cast. But as that's going to be a black and white, kind of doesn't really matter so much in that respect. But with this one, if we say auto, like so, let's reset that and go RGB and then auto. It's probably not so much of a difference. It's just the one that I used as an example, it's just super noticeable that it has a cast, and that's just an easy way to get rid of it. And Andy is asking, it's just to manipulate how auto works. You can still tinker afterwards, as he says. So it doesn't mean that it's a magic kind of one fit for all the time, but on an image like this it works really well. Leon says, why would you not have it on red, green and blue all the time? I guess you could, but it's just sort of generally unnecessary a lot of the time. It's only if you see that specific cast. I don't really know if there's a disadvantage to having it on there. Probably not. I mean, just leave it on RGB and then kind of see what happens for a while. It doesn't sound like a very professional or helpful answer, but I would imagine there's not really much of a disadvantage. Okay, if we carry on with this image, the tinkering, as Andy says, one thing that's very handy for landscapes and other things is straighten, like so, or R on your keyboard. Not much of a horizon here, but wherever I draw, so I'm going to guess the horizon, something like that. It'll rotate about that point. And if you need to tweak it, I find the best way is to go to your rotation and flip tool and then use your up and down cursor keys, or shift up and down. Shift just gives you 0.1 movements. If you let go of shift, you get 0.01. So then it's kind of easier to eye it in, I think, jogging up and down like so. Other than that, let's see, probably a little bit of clarity always helps. I might just darken it a tiny bit, to be honest. I'm probably working on the wrong one, aren't I? Oh no, I am on the right one. Let's just check. Yes, I am on the right one. The only other thing that, if we were keeping stuff to a minimum, we could do to this image is, classically, of course, the sky tends to be a bit brighter than the foreground. If I was a better photographer, I could have fixed that at time of capture with a gradient filter. But there's so much data here anyway. If we just grab exposure for a second and just kind of mess this around, I mean, there's loads of data in the top part of the image, so it's just a case of extracting it. And if you're not into doing local adjustments, or you don't feel the need, or you just don't want to, the one thing that you might want to learn is a gradient mask. So in our local adjustments tool tab, we have all the tools that work with local adjustments. So if you go to your default workspace, if you've messed around with it, then Capture One will load up all the tools which are compatible with local adjustments, which is most of them, with the exception of black and white, color balance and levels, for example. Pretty much everything else is there, but it's very simple to just grab a gradient mask, or G on your keyboard. Where I start drawing the mask will be at 100%, where I finish drawing it will have faded to 0. So you see, if I do a long pull like that and press M to show my mask, the mask is in red. And if I do a short pull, or even a very short pull, then we can have a very strict gradient, or we can have a much more versatile one. And it is a pretty, more flexible way of using a gradient than perhaps putting it on camera. But if you want to get as much right in camera as possible, then of course gradient makes sense. Then we could just take the exposure. Now anything I do now on this layer, very much like Photoshop of course, is only going to action on the top, so we could darken that down a bit, and even as it's still got a bit of a color cast, we could just up the white balance just to warm it up a tiny bit. It's kind of nice to still have a bit of that cold tint in it, but if we just want to take the edge off it a little bit, if I just reset exposure for a second, and then if we just turn this on so it's white balance only, you can just take the edge off it and darken it down a bit, maybe a bit more clarity itself on that one so the clouds look better, and away you go. And to be honest, if we didn't want to get involved in anything else, we could stop right there. If we zoom in, what's also a nice adjustment for landscape is structure, but this is so blooming sharp, I don't think I would add anything else. But on another image, we can see structure in play where it's not quite as sharp due to photographer error as such, my photographer error. But what structure does is just help that edge definition, but to be honest, I probably wouldn't want to do much here as it might overcook it. So there we go. If we option click, then you can see that's how it came out of camera, and with levels and a little darkening of the gradient above, it's way improved than it was before. So nothing particularly complicated there, just a couple of simple little tips to improve it a long way. Kevin says, do I have a certain workspace set up for travel landscape, certain tools you use or don't use? I don't really. If I wasn't showing you guys things, I probably would, but as I tend to try and work close to the default workspace so it's not totally confusing, I generally have a workspace a bit more like this, which gets rid of all the capture stuff, because we're not going to shoot tethered at home when you're working on images, so that gets rid of that. I put the exposure tool tab first, and I add a white balance tool to that just by right clicking. You can add any tool to any tool tab, and I then put color after that. So that's a bit more logical to me. And I don't have the browser showing because it takes up space. We can simply show and hide our viewer either by choosing it from the menu, or we use a shortcut key. I use the shortcut key which sits below my escape key. On a UK keyboard it's this squiggle, which is period apparently, and that's just a fast way to hide and show viewer. So if you want to edit your keyboard shortcuts, you can do so here, and you can choose whatever action you like is assigned to you, whatever shortcut you like. We do sell a Capture One keyboard as well, which is why you see Logic Keyboard, Germany, UK and US, which is pre-programmed with a whole bunch of helpful Capture One shortcuts and color-coded as well. So that works very nicely. Can we move the gradient mask? Yes, we can. So if we wanted to move the gradient mask, that was Julius asking. So you see, if I hold down Command, says he, I might be wrong. Oh no, I need a mask drawing tool up on my gradient mask. If I hold down Command, you see it changes to a hand with a splodge. So if you wanted to, let's just press M so we can see our mask. If you wanted to move it up a bit, then you could do so. I mean, if you moved it down, what you'll see is a big fat line like so. But if you wanted to push it up a little bit, you could do so. But you can also edit a mask like, edit a gradient mask like any other mask. So if you wanted to erase aspects of it or add to it using erase and draw brushes, you could do so. To flip between original and your improvements, yes, Elizabeth. If we option click or alt, then you can see before and after. So option click the reset button up the top here. So before, and as long as I hold it down, that gives me a toggle between our adjustments. Stuart says, will the current version of Capture One run with the release of OS High Sierra? I'm going to say no right now. The reason for that is that even though there's betas out of High Sierra, Apple were notorious for changing stuff at the 11th hour. So we won't say support it until the release is out in the field and we can test it with whatever we're currently working on. And yes, Jeff, to determine which keys are mapped to which function, say help, keyboard shortcut summary. And then this will open a web page, which is on my other monitor, but I'll bring it over here, which shows you all your various keyboard shortcuts, and it's your specific set. So you can see this is Logic Keyboard UK version 2 because I've made a few changes to it, and that shows me all those. You can print them out and commit to memory. Alrighty, let's do another one. So I was gonna do, I think, this one next. So if I do Command R to reset, that's everything, and this is a black and white version, there's a color version, and so on. Now, photographer error here, I stupidly shot this. If we look at the metadata f1.8, so it's a little bit soft. It's not bad, but it's a little bit soft. I think because the rain was just about to hit us in the face, so I just kind of hopped out the car and took a quick shot, and you can just about see the rain pattern there. So it's not the optimum aperture, so we can always sharpen that up a bit to do so. So first of all, handy straighten tool again. I don't know if Mother Nature has made these rock lines to be perfectly horizontal. Let's see, maybe not. I use the keyboard shortcut C for crop. So if you press C, you get the crop cursor. If we press V, we get the pointer. And if we press H, we get the hand tool. So CVH, that's a good little set of shortcuts to remember, because when you're in the pan tool, we can double click to zoom in and see it's just ever so slightly soft. So pressing C for crop again. Let's just change the crop. Now I don't necessarily like seeing the metadata down here, so I tend to hide that. I have a shortcut for that as well, so hide those labels. And what can we do to improve this? Well, first of all, might have a bit of a cast, I don't know. What are my preferences in? Let's just throw it on red, green and blue and say auto. Might be a little bit harsh. See, I think that's going a bit too far for my liking. So I'd actually Command Z and undo that. Go back to the normal one, and then I would just pull it in a little bit because I don't want this to be overly contrasty. So I would prefer in this case to do it manually. Auto isn't necessarily always the best policy. Going back to local adjustments, and I think personally for landscapes and travel work, we'll come back to some more sort of documentary street stuff after this one. But if you can not necessarily master, but just learn a few local adjustment tricks, it's a huge help to working with landscapes and travel stuff, which you'll see. So in this kind of image, I know that we've got some fun rain going on here. We've got a bit of sunlight on there, and this is dropping into shadow. If we just drop the exposure down, then we can see what all those clouds are doing in the background. So I like to kind of take inspiration from nature and just enhance what is already there. It's kind of cheating, but my background a long time ago was printing, and we never just put a negative in an enlarger and printed it how it came out. We made choices on contrast, exposure time, and we did dodging and burning, so we made just the same decisions then as we do now, except we're not sitting in a room full of stinky chemicals. I much prefer it this way. So I want to darken this area down a bit, and probably this, so we just get more of that sunspot in the middle, and darken down the clouds a bit so we see a bit more of those, and fix the slight softness on the rock face as such. So first thing, I'm going to make a new layer, whoops, one too many, by hitting plus, and let's just call that darken. And right now, if I adjust a tool, let's say if I pull exposure around, nothing happens because we've got no mask on the image itself. So if you want to pre-visualize what your adjustments could do, then a handy trick is to say, excuse me, invert mask. And invert mask will simply put a mask over the whole image like so. So now I can pre-visualize and experiment with different adjustments to get the job done. Now I could do exposure, which sometimes works. It's kind of blocking that up a bit too quick. If I hover my mouse over the image, if we look at curves, the little orange vertical line tells me what tonal range I'm sitting in. So I want to darken this area a bit, which is kind of sitting around this peak over here, and I want to darken this bit, which is kind of a bit higher, sort of a mid-tone. So if I make myself a curve shape, something like that, then I can avoid to not go too dark here and just bring that down a little bit as well. But that's going over the whole image. It's kind of nice here, but it's a bit too much there as such. I might force that a bit more. And now what I can do is invert that back. By the way, that can also be a shortcut, Jeff is asking. So I would normally do this with a shortcut. But the reason why I don't necessarily use a shortcut here is because it's not very easy for you to see. So we can say invert mask, and then that will basically cancel everything else out that we've just done. So now I get the choice to pick a brush and draw it back in. Now, one of the most important adjustments that we've got to play with in brush settings, which is a right click to bring them up, is flow and opacity, because you'll see now if I just start to try and brush my curve adjustment in, helps if I turn the mask off, then you see it's just happening way too quick and it looks really ugly, and you won't think that's a great technique. So let's just undo those steps. We do that, and then now we need to brush it in a way that brings it up in a nice controlled aspect. Where we want to build it up, I might want to do a little bit here, bit more there, bit more in the clouds, and I want to do that by taking down my flow. So flow is a movement-based adjustment, I think is the best thing to say, which means every time I move the brush back and forth, like so, I'm not drawing right now, I'm just moving, it will lay down 10% of my adjustment. So it will build up in 10% increments. We can make that even smaller. And if you want to reduce the effect more, you can take your opacity down. So for example, now I can freely just kind of add a little bit more density here, and it's happening nice and slowly. You probably don't believe anything's happening, but if I turn the layer off, then you can see a slight difference. If it's not happening fast enough, we could up the flow a bit. So now I can just come over here and darken this bit down slightly. With the sky, I might want to happen that a bit faster, so let's up the flow a bit more, and then I can just brush around like so, for example. And again, if it's not happening fast enough, then you can just bring up your flow or opacity even more. So now if I turn this layer on and off, then you can see the subtle changes that I've made. So if we want the sky a bit more, let's just up the opacity and then just bring this bit in like so. Now, if you looked at this image now, you'd have no clue that there was a mask on there. If I press M, you can see the mask has got varying opacity and so on, but it's nice and subtle. We've got a bit more definition there, haven't gone crazy, and we've just darkened this down a bit. Now, if I want to do the opposite, I could say lighten. And yes, who was that asking? Vim. That luma curve in this case I feel is quite important. And the thing with luma is that it won't affect our colors at all. So whenever you play with an RGB curve, let's just go to the background for a second. Whenever you play with RGB, if we just throw in some contrast, our saturation changes as well, which we don't want. So when we come to perhaps doing some density adjustments, we want to make sure that our color is not affected. So if we're going to lighten, I'm going to say invert mask again. So that's over the whole image. And I kind of want to lighten this bit, I guess, around here, which is sort of just hovering around probably the midtones again. So I just give that a little bit of a tweak, like so, not too much. Invert this back, take a brush. Whoops, I did wrong thing. Take a brush or B on your keyboard, probably nice low flow, and then I can just lighten this bit a tiny bit more. If it's too much, press E and you get erase, and then you can just go back and fix what you did, because that was a bit too much. So if I do brush again, probably make my flow even lower, and then just lighten up this little section in the middle, like so. To finish, I'm just going to throw in a bit of a vignette, because I think that would help. And also about the softness side of things. If we zoom in, I said it's not bad, but it could probably do with a bit of a lift. Now we could just probably get away with putting some clarity on the whole image. If we click on the name of the tool, we can temporarily reset it. So that's no clarity and some clarity. Probably not that much. And if we zoom in to, whoops, excuse me, too many clicks, 100%, and just add a bit of structure, then straight away it kind of just gets rid of that fuzziness. It might be hard to see on the webinar transmission, but if I option click on clarity, and I'll make sure it's reset, so that's before and after. It's subtle, but it just takes the edge off that softness. Said you probably won't see it on the bandwidth that the webinar's running at, but try it on your own images if you like. We could probably even go more than that. We could get away with that. It's enough data for us not to ruin it. The only thing I don't like, that looks a bit bright, but we might be able to get away with just a little slight highlight recovery, perhaps, like so. So again, if we option click our reset button, that was before and after. So not really a great deal of changes, but it's a lot more interesting than it was when it came out of camera, for sure. Excuse me. Jim said, when would I use the airbrush setting? You know what, Jim? Never used it. Doesn't mean to say there's not a place for it, but I haven't come across a situation where I would want to use it. Airbrush, if you don't know, just is like a spray can. So if we have airbrush on, let's just go to, let's just grab an empty image and we grab our brush and we do full flow and airbrush. Let's just turn flow down a bit and I paint. Let's turn the mask on. It's like just spraying with a spray can kind of thing. And if we have flow up high, then it happens really quick. If we have flow down low, then it happens slower. Non-existent there because we're at 0, like so. But as I said, I haven't personally found a use for it. Christos was asking again about flow. If I turn off airbrush, you'll see now if I brush, you see the mask is building up gradually. So with a very weak mask, so if we just do a little bit here and then we do lots down here, if I hide that mask and say play with exposure, you can see where our flow built up the mask in a small amounts. It's more subtle than where we had, you know, maximum. So if I just do one pass of the brush there, we don't get much. If I go back and forward, then it builds up our adjustment, which basically means that we end up with more subtle results. Yes, structure is some kind of sharpening. It's basically helping to improve edge definition. So if you did it on a person, they probably wouldn't thank you. But if we did it on a shot like this, let's just go into, say, 200%. Let's turn this off. Then it will just help bring out all that extra edge detail and so on in the rocks. Have a look on your own shots. You probably won't see a big enough result on a webinar transmission. Pen pressure setting only works on Wacom, and it only relates to the size. But a little note about that, I don't find that as useful because look what happens whenever I right click. Look where my cursor is. It's always exactly on the size control. So as soon as I right click, I don't even have to look at this dialog. I know that it's on size. So if I'm doing some selective darkening, let's just put flow down to something sensible, and we want to do a small area, then I can darken over here like so. And then if I want to do a big area, right click, I don't even have to look at the dialog. I know if I drag mouse right, then basically I'm going to get my cursor changed like so. I find that much faster than using keyboard shortcuts and so on and so forth. If you're interested in doing local adjustments, I would suggest that using a mouse is pretty hard work, I find, because using a pen on a tablet like I am now, you can do really fast brush movements like you're painting for real. I mean, your webinar transmission is about 10 frames a second, so this will look quite jerky right now. On the recording, it will be smooth, but I can brush really quickly back and forth much faster than I could compared to using a mouse. So I would struggle with the mouse to do this kind of stuff. Okay, Kevin's asking about black and white. Kevin, don't worry, we're going to do a black and white. If we wanted to make this one black and white, probably we would manage to say enable black and white and job done almost. But we'd do an in-depth black and white on another one. Okay, let's come away from landscape for a moment and look at something streety as such. This isn't one of my images, it's from a photographer friend of mine, John Wildgoose. Lucky enough to fly all over the world shooting for corporate clients in all different situations. And obviously this kind of work, you're not always guaranteed of perfect light, perfect situation. He's working in amongst people. You deal with what you've got. In this situation, lovely shot, but his face is just falling into darkness a little bit, so we might want to lift that up, but we're going to do a slightly different technique. So let's make a new layer and we just call that lighten face, like so. Once again, we would say invert mask. Yes, that can be a shortcut, of course, and making new layers can be shortcuts as well, which all of that I would do with keyboard shortcuts, for example, and selecting different layers. So I can move different layers. I can add layers with shortcuts, as you can see. So this is me just using shortcuts and so on. I can invert the mask if I wish. So if I just show the mask, press invert mask as a shortcut, we can just do that easily and so on. So I've got my mask inverted as such. Now we've got some choices. We could bring up the exposure to lighten his face, but that kind of affects everything. We could do a bit of a curve sort of thing to lighten up his face, but in this case we want to, he's very much in shadow, so I reckon if we just pull up shadows, we've got a pretty targeted adjustment. It's not messing up his shirt or anything, and it's only really affecting the background and so on, but it does a nice job of just lifting his face. Now we could just say, well, that's fine, but if we turn the layer on and off, it's affecting the background, which I don't really want to happen. So let's invert mask back, grab a draw mask brush, and yeah, that's probably low flow, and then we can just brighten up just a little bit on the face and his hand, like so. Now because we were using a shadow recovery locally, then what it means, if you look at my mask, it's pretty, if I press M so we can see the mask, it's pretty sloppy. I mean, I'll make it really sloppy. I'll do some there as well. So I haven't carefully cut around his face. I haven't cut around his spectacles or hand or anything like that. And I think as soon as you start doing that, this is when it becomes obvious that you're using masks. If you can do it in a nice subtle way, so much the better. So if I turn my mask off and we turn the layer on and off, like so, you can see it's really only affecting this zone. It's not affecting the background at all, like so. And if we feel we've done too much, E for erase, and then we could just take it back down a bit more, B for brush, open it back up. Really super nice way to work. The two circles, who's asking that? Alexi. So the central circle is where you are at 100%, and the outer circle is where it's faded to 0. So if we go fully hard, then we have no feathering, and if we go fully soft, we have loads of feathering, like so. Now the only other thing with this image is that this area is kind of a bit distracting, because it's the most saturated color in the shot, and we tend to be drawn to things like that and brighter colors and so on. So to alleviate that, we could take our good old advanced color editor, we could take our picker, select it, and then say let's desaturate. The only thing is it kind of kills all the mood and the warm lighting on him as well, which is actually quite nice. So we can do that in another clever way. Let's make a new layer and call that color kill or cure kill. I'm going to do a really rough mask. We're going to go full opacity, full flow. So I'm just going to do a rough mask over here, something like that. Take our color editor again, pick in this area, this one, and then now I can desaturate without fear of messing up anything else. So I wouldn't go 0, that looks a bit weird. I would just take it down a little bit and maybe darken it just a touch, just so it's less distracting. And then on the image itself, we could even warm it up on his shirt if we wanted to, just to tone him up a little bit. But then we will affect the background, so that wouldn't work as well. So what we could do, if we wanted to, we could make another layer and do a similar thing with that one if we wished. Otherwise, I think for this one, I will just bump up the clarity a little bit. Maybe in hindsight, it's a bit dark. So let's just open that up a touch as well. If we option click everything, we can see before and after. Because right now, as it looks now, you're really struggling to not look to the right hand side. But if we flip it round, then his face is now brighter and this is less distracting as such. Julius asked, when you're editing shortcuts, will it warn you if you try to assign a current shortcut? Yes, it will. So don't worry about that. Which model works well with Capture One? You know what, you don't have to spend a bunch of money on a Wacom if you don't want to. If you want to, you can go ahead and go crazy and buy the top model. I have a much, well, not much older, it's not the most recent, it is actually, it's an Intuos Pro Small, so it's relatively new. They have a cheaper line, which is just the Intuos, which has less levels of sensitivity and less kind of shortcut keys. But if you don't use any of that stuff, like me, then you could save some money and just buy the cheaper Intuos. That'll work just as well. I use the Wacom tablet for everything, writing emails, writing documents, Photoshop, Capture One. I never pick up a mouse. I just find it much more comfortable. Okie dokie. All right. What's next? Let's go to how are we doing for time? Okay, so we do, let's just do this one, and then I want to show you a couple of things about this sequence. So let's do this one. Now this is from John as well, and you might think I'm not going to bother with this shot because the white balance is really off and it's totally dark and there's nothing I can do about that. Don't be surprised of again what data is lurking in the file. I mean, this one, the white balance is heavily influenced by the street lighting that we have here, and everything is kind of the wrong color. But if we grab white balance, and you'll find when you're on the fringes of different color temperatures, you'll get to a point where it will suddenly just kind of tip, and there we go. We've got much nicer range of colors going on, and a little lift of exposure, maybe some shadows, not too much, and we've come a long way from that's how it came out of camera and that's how it looks now with only white balance, exposure and shadow. That's a perfectly usable image now. Yes, it's a bit grainy because it's probably relatively high ISO 800, it's slightly under, but it's still totally usable. Really no problem at all. Whoops, wrong shortcut key. And if we wanted to lighten up this guy a bit, as he's our subject, then let's just make a new layer, dude, take a brush, and I might even just gamble and say probably just guesswork. If I do a bit of shadow recovery and take this quite small and take the flow down, I reckon we could just probably wing it without having to invert mask or whatever, like so. So now we've just lifted him up a tiny bit, just so he's a bit more obvious, like so, without having to do invert or anything. So if you reckon you can guess it in, then why not? But if you really want to see what your local adjustment is doing, the old invert mask trick is not a bad idea. So again, if we do option click, whoops, wrong one, option click, before and after. Loads of detail in a raw file. Just don't kind of assume that it's irrecoverable, because the chances are it probably is. Okay, this one that I wanted to show you, this is a sequence of images. So we've got F8 going up to F22, exactly the same image shot by my colleague Drew, which you may have seen on webinars as well. I'm pulling these two out because this is the extremes of our aperture range. So we've got F8 to F22. If I shift click, whoops, wrong shortcut. If I shift click up here, let's shift click up here, that will zoom them both to 100%. And if I spacebar shift around, let's just pick a spot. And I probably need to just reset this one on the right. So let's turn that off. So what I wanted to show you with these two, so exactly the same image, same lens, same time, as close as they could be. F8 on the left, F22 on the right. Now again, it might be tricky on our webinar transmission, but essentially what you'll see is that as you narrow down the aperture, we're going to get some softening associated with smaller apertures. So you can see, if you look at the really fine detail on the grass, it's a little bit more obvious compared to this one. Now, depending on your lens camera combination, you might see a softness start happening at f22, it might be f16, it might be f32, and so on and so forth. That depends on your camera. But in the lens correction tool, there is a special button which is off by default, which will correct for softness caused by smaller apertures. So if I tap this one on, then Capture One will do a whole bunch of complicated maths, which pretty much brings it up to the level of sharpness if you'd shot on a more open aperture. So that's something that's worth thinking about if you want to shoot and think, you know what, I'd love to have as much depth of field as possible, but I don't want to sacrifice sharpness. Then flick on Diffraction Correction, and that will help a lot with sharpening. Now, it's not on by default because it will cause extra time on processing. So your images will take longer to process. but it's definitely worth it if you're shooting at tighter apertures. But it's not something that's going to really make any difference on wider open apertures, and it would be pointless turning it on because all it's going to do is make your processing time longer. Does diffraction correction work for any lens or only ones that have a lens profile? Even if we're on generic, so let's just say reset and continue. Let's do that and say generic, and we turn on diffraction correction. It will still help, but I believe the correction to be better if we have a lens profile, but it will still work if there's no profile there, don't worry. Okay, so that was something that is quite important that I wanted to point out. How are we doing for time? We're squeezing this one, and lastly the black and white. So this image, also nice for street, is the wonderful color balance tool, which you'll find in the color tool tab. And the nice thing about this tool is there's no science involved. It's all about look and feel. So how this tool works is that we have a master tab and a three-way tab. So the master tab refers to the whole image, and the three-way tab refers to shadows, midtones and highlights. And for street work, it can be a really nice way to add your own kind of emotion, feel and so on to the image. I'll just brighten it up a bit and bring the highlights back down. So the master tab is kind of the closest analogy, is like grabbing a colored lens, colored filter, and sticking that in front of the lens. So if you want to warm everything up or cool everything down or make everything red, it's just a case of pulling that central spot towards the color that you want to tone the image. Now the further you pull it out, the strongest it will be. So here it would be very subtle, here it would be very strong. But that's a nice way to just add an overall tint to an image. Now with the three-way, we've split up shadows, midtones, highlights. So for example, if we look in his hair and we go this way with the shadows, we can have colder shadows as an example, and then we could warm up midtones and highlights, or we could take the highlights colder as well or warmer. It's totally up to you. So as I said, no science involved, just a really nice way to add a color tone to an image, maybe in combination with saturation as well, to get your own personal color tint as such, ignoring the fact that it's not color accurate and all that sort of stuff. Who cares? Also in these three wheels, there's a slider on the right, which is density based. So we can also use this tool to play with contrast. So if I go down this way, then we can darken blacks, or we can lift the blacks. So if I did say lighter blacks and darker highlights, then we would flatten our image. If I did the opposite and did darker blacks and brighter highlights, then we would have a higher contrast image. So if you don't want to get involved in curves, RGB and Luma and so on, then this is a nice way to play with contrast as well. It's not the same as shadow recovery. So if I grabbed the shadow recovery and say pulled that to the right, so you see it opens up the shadows, giving us more detail. If we do the same with the slider here, helps if you grab it, then you see it's not liberating any more detail, it's just lightening up those areas. So it's a different sort of effect, before anyone asks. Alexi says, can I stitch a panorama? No, you can't stitch a panorama. Dieter is asking a similar thing. Could I combine 5 images with different values to one? No, what I've found the best thing to do if you want to stitch, if in your process recipe, let's say you want to process everything to TIFF, this is the second to last tool tab. If you say open with Photoshop, it will then open them all up into Photoshop, and then you can combine them pretty swiftly with Photo Merge, for example. But there is no stitching in Capture One itself. Okay, so before we run out of time, let's have a look at black and white. Let's just drop color balance tool back. And as I said with this tool, there's no science to it. You know, it's just all on look and feel. So anybody can use this tool. It's really simple. Okay, let's make this one a black and white. This was shot with an older Phase 1 camera, P45 Plus, so that's from a long time ago. This shot from a friend of mine, Steve Gosling, photographer in the UK. This was shot in 2013, for example. But old camera, modern RAW processor, still gives us wonderful image and clarity and all those things that make medium format great, even though this is an older system. So black and white tool is kind of strangely in the color tool tab, and doing a black and white, I'd say a good black and white starts with a good color. So before we do anything else, I'll just brighten this one a bit, pull in my shadows and highlights slightly, but not go sort of too crazy, just a little bit of a tweak. Now go back to the black and white tool and enable black and white. So now we have a black and white. And then your next task is to look at the various different color channels or tones, and all these do is change density. So this rock probably has red and yellow in it, so if I grab this, you can see it's just affecting those rocks at the back. So whether you want them to be brighter or darker is up to you. I might just lighten them a touch, I think, or not. Yeah, let's lighten them a touch. Yellow, just affecting the tops of those a bit. Green, probably not a great deal. Nope, nothing happening. Cyan, maybe a little bit in the color tone. So let's darken those shadows a bit. And then blue, loads in there. So let's take that down a bit as well. And magenta, not really. Oh, a tiny bit just in the top of that haze there. So look, if we play around with magenta, we're just affecting that small area. So let's get a nice roll off like so. So now that we've dialed in our base black and white corrections, again, a curve is probably a good friend to play with. And a luma curve again, because we don't want to upset any of our color. So if we saturate a color more, it's going to change our density. So this is pure density. So let's just throw in a bit of extra, maybe not that much, bit of extra contrast. And I am going to lift the shadows a bit, which won't flatten it. It's just going to lighten up those areas. But if you think that'll negate what the curve's doing, it won't. And if I option click on my curve, see, even by lifting the shadows, the curve is still doing something. And maybe just the highlights ever so slightly. See if we can get away without doing any sort of gradient mask on the sky. Looks like we've got a spot, I think. Yeah, small spot, so let's grab spot removal. Change it to dust, as this is dust on the sensor, I would guess. So let's splat that so it's gone. And then now, again, like you saw earlier with the other rock picture, I would personally, I really like these lighter parts of the rock. So I would exaggerate that more. So plus, call that lighten. Invert. Shortcut it, of course, would be the sensible thing to do. Then I would look at my curve, just hover the cursor over, pretty much just under midtones, so about there, just to lift those up a bit. Invert that back. Press B for brush on my keyboard. Right click to see my adjustment, so nice and soft, nice low flow, and then I would just lighten up these little bits and pieces. And if I want to just lighten up this ridge, I think I would probably do that as well, and maybe just make a bit of a shape like that. And if I want to do a larger pass, I might just lighten up this central bit a tiny bit more as well. So I haven't done much, but it's all about being subtle. If we turn the layer off, then you can see before and after. And I'll do exactly the same thing, but I'll say darken this time. And again, I just probably want to do a little tweak like that, and I'll guesstimate now, mostly because we're a bit low on time, but sometimes I'll just guess what it should be. Grab my brush, and now I can darken the areas that I want to. So I'll just darken it here, and then these kind of areas, just darken those a tiny bit as well, maybe this peak and this peak. As they're a bit bright at the back, we could actually use this to just take down my sky a tiny bit as well. Saves me having to do a gradient, but that works quite nicely. And last but not least, this one really shows what structure can do. So there's loads of detail in these. So if we grab structure and just pump that up, then all of a sudden we reveal all these nice veins and marks and so on in the rock, which we couldn't quite see before. So structure really helps on an image like this, and it doesn't look over sharp. I mean, it was shot on a, I think Steve said it's an Alpha system, so great lens, even though it's a very old digital back. I mean, you can see the quality still looks great. Structure really brings all that additional stuff out. We can push it quite hard and we get a really lovely black and white image. So if I reset the local adjustments, wrong button, option click. So before and after, very subtle, just a little bit before and after. And if we option click the master reset, that's our color image and then our black and white. I mean, after doing everything, I then might lighten that up a bit more. Go to darken, let's just darken those bits a bit more. Go to lighten, is it worth tweaking those bits a bit more, and so on, like so. Darken, I might just do a little bit more, open up the flow a bit and just do a bit more on this section. Like so. There we go. How could I change the grey sky to a blue one? Shoot it again, I think. You can certainly change the appearance of colours with the colour editor. Where are we? I mean, that's what the colour editor is designed for. But if you have no colour to pick, then you don't really have any data to adjust. So if we had a faint blue sky, we could pump that blue up. But if it was a purely grey sky, then you'll have no luck in really finding anything else. You can see the mood. Did I start with linear response for your base curve? No, I didn't actually on any of these, and that's not something we covered. But if you really want to kind of spend a bit more time, adjustment, if we go to linear response, this gives us a much flatter starting point, which can liberate extra detail in the image, but you'll have to spend a bit more time doing it. But if you look in base characteristics tool, I'll just turn off black and white for a second. So if we go to linear response, then you get a much flatter start point compared to the normal curves that we apply on an image by default. If you're interested in that, go back in the catalogue and watch a webinar with Drew, my colleague Drew Outdorfer and myself, and this is a technique he does a lot, much more than me. He's more conscientious than me, clearly. So that's worth seeing it on some of his images. And again, I think he says it's not something he always does by default, but it can give you a better image if you're prepared to put the work in. Kathy says, how do you get the viewer to show all your thumbnails with the scroll bar on the right of your screen? So if you say view, show browser, like so, and we can look here, you can say place browser below. So this will give you a thick film strip, which actually eats into your space for the image. So it actually makes more sense to say place browser right, Shift Command B, and then your browser is over there, and that gives you more room to play with your image, or Command B or Control B on PC to hide and show, and Control or Command B to hide tools. There is a full screen mode as well, which I have set to F. So if I tap F, then you can work unhindered image only, which is nice. And if you wave your cursor to the right, you get a pop-up tool, left rather, and I could still do Command T, get my tools up and work like this if I want to, which is a nice way to work because you get maximum real estate, especially if you're on a laptop, for example. Autofill mask tool to mask a big area. Yes, there is one. So if we press B for brush, you can turn on auto masking if you wish. Again, it's not something I very rarely use it. If I've used it once or twice this year, that's probably it. but that will find its edge around items. But I personally think that gives you a worse result than having nice soft feathered masks. Can we move a gradient mask? Well, you can move any mask. That was, who was that asking? Alicia. Sorry, Alicia, your name just zipped off screen for a second. So if you want to move a mask, and that can be any mask, then if you're on the mask and you have the brush tool or erase tool, if you hold down Command if you're Apple, or it's probably Alt if you're on PC, then this will allow you to drag masks around. So let's just show you on let's get out of full screen for a second. Let's just show you on a different image. So let's just draw a rough mask here so you can see it. So if I draw a mask, let's press M to bring up the mask. If I hold down Command, then I can actually move the mask wherever I like. Probably Alt on PC, Command on the Mac. Do you save all photos to output for print until you are finished? Well, I'm quite bad. I don't do a lot of printing. But to be honest, a lot of stuff I do would be more than acceptable to go straight to print as such. Whether you use Capture One or not, that's up to you. You can say file print if you have a decent printer, or don't forget in your process recipes, like if we were going to send this to print and we knew our print dimensions, we could put in our dimensions here. Let's say we were doing a 20 by 16 print, for example. If I zoom to 100% and then turn on this one, recipe proofing, Capture One will resize it to my screen so we can assess what the sharpening looks like. And we can also, in adjustments, add more sharpening for print, for example, which will just give us a bit of an extra boost as well. So don't forget, you can turn on the spectacle icon to proof your image to its exact output. Okay, how are we doing for time? We are out of time, unfortunately. So I hope you picked up some useful tips, etc. for your processing today. If you want to come back, if you want more punishment, then next week I have a guest, Paul Reifer, who's an architecture photographer, works out of UK and Asia and all over the place. Architecture photography, notoriously difficult to correct, basically because you have so many different light sources, so many different densities, but there's all kinds of clever things you can do in Capture One for that. And Paul is going to join me and reveal his secrets. So if you look out for a follow-up email tomorrow, then you can sign up for Paul's webinar with me next week as well. Alrighty, thanks for your time again, ladies and gentlemen, and hope to see you all next week. Take care.